Imagine a candlelit hall inside the forbidden city. Heavy curtains dull the glow, and incense drifts through the air, blurring the faces of officials gathered in silence. Outside, the night is still, but inside, a scroll is being unrolled. A list of punishments said to keep order in the empire. Some of the names leap from the parchment like warnings: lingchi, Kang, 5 pains. To modern ears they sound terrifying, and over centuries they've grown even larger in legend. But how much of what we think we know about torture in ancient China is true, and how much is myth? For centuries, stories of imperial cruelty have captured imaginations in the West and East alike. Illustrations in old books, sensational travelers' tales, even films and pulp novels have shown an empire obsessed with gruesome spectacle. Yet history is rarely so simple. Ancient China had a long legal tradition, complex debates about justice, and a bureaucracy that valued order over chaos. Punishment was indeed part of that order, but it existed inside a framework, one shaped by Confucian ideals, legalist rigor, and the practical need to govern millions. To understand torture in China's past, we need to separate vivid legend from the quieter, messier truth. Let us begin with where these stories came from. During the late Ming and Qing dynasties, European visitors wrote about what they thought they saw. Cages in marketplaces, people wearing wooden collars, or rumors of executions called death by 1,000 cuts. Some of those accounts were exaggerated to shock audiences back home. Others were based on partial truths, real punishments described without their legal context, or rare penalties portrayed as everyday scenes. Over time, these tales mingled with political propaganda and the drama of imperial decline, creating a picture more theatrical than historical. Chinese records tell a more measured story. The earliest law codes, like the Qin and Han statutes, described a graded system of penalties. At the bottom were fines or forced labor. Next came flogging and short imprisonment. More serious crimes could lead to exile, tattooing, or wearing an iron collar. Only the gravest, treason, mass murder, or shocking corruption, invited penalties like execution. Torture, in the sense of inflicting suffering to force confessions, was permitted in certain periods but tightly regulated, at least on paper. Magistrates were expected to follow limits on how many blows they could administer and were warned that if an accused person died under questioning, the official could face punishment himself. One of the most famous implements of discipline was the kang, a heavy wooden collar worn around the neck. Popular images show it as a brutal device meant only to humiliate. In reality, the kang served as a kind of mobile pillory. Offenders, often petty thieves or debtors, were made to stand in public wearing a board inscribed with their name and crime. It was painful and embarrassing, but also a way to show that justice had been done without resorting to bloodier penalties. Officials sometimes reduced its weight for frail offenders or allowed family to bring food, revealing a bureaucratic concern, however limited, for human endurance. Another term that haunts conversations about Chinese punishment is lingchi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts. This execution method has become a byword for unimaginable cruelty. But historians now stress that its practice was rare and mostly confined to crimes considered especially heinous: the murder of close kin, treason, or attempts to kill the emperor. Far from being a routine sentence, lingchi was a political statement about ultimate betrayal. Even then, the procedure was less theatrical than later art suggested. Photographs from the late Qing, taken as Western influence spread, were sensationalized, feeding myths that such executions were constant features of Chinese justice. In truth, they marked the farthest edge of imperial law. Not all punishments involved pain. Shame and control were central to Chinese legal culture. Confucian ideals prized hierarchy, harmony, and filial piety. A wrongdoer disrupted not just the law but the moral order. So penalties often worked to restore that balance by marking disgrace. Wearing a placard, kneeling at a city gate, or undergoing a formal reprimand before elders could weigh as heavily on reputation as a whip on the back. Even the notorious bamboo beating, a staple of county courts, was usually delivered in fixed numbers with thin rods, intended as correction rather than mutilation, though of course injuries could occur if a magistrate ignored limits. There is also the question of torture in interrogations. Chinese officials believed confessions sealed the truth, so they sometimes used force to obtain them. Records from the Ming show devices like finger presses or small whips, meant to apply pressure but not maim. Manuals advised caution. A confession extracted too harshly risked falsehood, and a dead suspect was useless for trial. Critics inside the bureaucracy argued that moral persuasion and evidence should outweigh brute force. Reformist officials of the Qing even sought to reduce coercion, though results depended on the magistrate's character and the political climate. A particularly persistent myth is that ancient China delighted in inventing exotic instruments of agony. Tales of the Iron Maiden, the rat torture, or chairs studded with spikes appear in lurid collections but lack proof in Chinese archives. Many of these images trace back to European imaginations or later anti-imperial propaganda. Actual Chinese punishment culture was less about endless novelty than about formalized rituals meant to reinforce authority. When cruelty did happen, it often sprang from abuse of power or periods of chaos rather than from standard law. Understanding this complexity changes how we see Chinese history. Instead of a monolith of brutality, we find a debate between harshness and restraint, between order and mercy. Philosophers like Confucius spoke of governing through virtue, while legalist thinkers insisted fear kept society stable. Dynasties swung between those poles. The Qin famously severe, the Tang relatively lenient, the Ming oscillating as corruption or insecurity rose. Torture, when it appeared, belonged to those moments where suspicion overshadowed trust. Consider the case of Zhang Shiqing, a salt smuggler who became a rebel leader in the 14th century. When captured, chroniclers say he endured fierce questioning before being executed. Yet later moralists used his fate less to relish pain than to warn against treachery and rebellion. Stories of punishment often carried such lessons, blending legal history with moral theater. By the late 19th century, as reformers sought to modernize China's laws, they looked with embarrassment at punishments seen as relics. Lingchi was formally abolished in 1905, along with branding and some corporal penalties. Influenced by Western legal codes, the Qing replaced them with prisons and standardized trials. Ironically, this period also cemented the most lurid legends, because missionaries and journalists publicized photographs just as the practices were fading. The shock value fixed an image of timeless cruelty, even though the reality was one of decline and change. To explore torture in ancient China, then, is to walk a path between extremes. Neither to deny suffering where it occurred, nor to believe every chilling tale without scrutiny. The record shows pain, yes, but also bureaucracy, moral debate, and reform. It shows that punishments, like laws everywhere, reflected the anxieties of their age, about loyalty, order, and the boundaries of human authority. Step deeper into the archives of Chinese law and you find stories less about spectacle and more about the subtleties of control. Many punishments were designed not only to discipline the body but also to impress moral order on the mind. Officials often viewed suffering as a teacher, a way to correct errant paths rather than to revel in cruelty. Yet the boundary between lesson and abuse could blur, especially when politics, gender, or fear of rebellion colored the courtroom. Consider the everyday work of a county magistrate. He was judge, investigator, and administrator all at once. Behind the carved doors of a yamen, or government office, the magistrate presided over hearings while clerks recorded testimony. In theory, law codes such as the Tang and later the Ming and Qing statutes carefully listed when and how an official could employ force. Bamboo rods were graded by thickness, the number of blows strictly counted. Devices like the finger press or ankle frame were meant to apply discomfort only until the accused spoke or evidence cleared them. Abuse, striking beyond the limit or torturing without authorization, could cost an official his career, even his life. Still, much depended on temperament. A conscientious magistrate might treat suspects gently, while another, eager for swift confessions, could push boundaries. Gender added another layer. Women accused of crimes or summoned as witnesses were supposed to be treated with decorum. Manuals advised questioning them in private chambers with female attendants present. Modesty was a legal value as much as a cultural one. But history records breaches of this etiquette, especially during high-stakes investigations. In the Ming Dynasty, a scandal in Jiangnan described officials mishandling interrogations of courtesans linked to political plots, sparking debate about protecting women's dignity. Even so, the archives show fewer references to physical torment of women than to men, not because women were free from harm, but because many cases were resolved through fines, confinement, or pressure on family honor rather than overt brutality. Another famous punishment was tattooing, called ci pei or mo xing. Characters were etched or pricked onto the skin of offenders, marking them as criminals for life. The practice dates back to early dynasties and lasted in some regions until the Song. It was not usually paired with torture, yet its psychological weight was heavy. To bear a stigma on one's face or arm meant exclusion from respectable society, a sentence that could last longer than any prison term. Physical torment took its most elaborate form in capital sentences reserved for rebellion, treachery, or plots against the throne. Lingchi, already discussed, was one. Another was slow strangulation following public shaming. But far more common were beheadings or hangings carried out swiftly, often after rituals acknowledging the emperor's authority over life and death. In some cases, punishments combined with exile, the convict's family sent to remote frontiers, a penalty intended to sever social roots more than to inflict agony. Behind these procedures lay two enduring philosophies. Legalist thinkers, heirs of Han Fizi, argued that strict, even harsh law deterred chaos. Confucian scholars, by contrast, urged rulers to cultivate virtue and reserve harshness for last resort. Imperial codes wove both views together. They created a ladder of responses: admonition, fines, beating, imprisonment, exile, and only then capital measures. Torture during questioning was legally a tool, not a sentence. Its legitimacy depended on restraint. That balance explains why dynasties periodically revised statutes to clarify how far an examiner could go. Historical episodes reveal how fragile that balance could be. During the Ming, a notorious case known as the Eastern Depot interrogations targeted scholars accused of criticizing the emperor. Secret police operated beyond normal courts, using threats and painful restraints to silence dissent. The abuses later fueled reforms aiming to limit extralegal prisons. Similarly, in the late Qing, anti-corruption drives sometimes degenerated into purges where suspects were battered to extract names of accomplices. These events remind us that cruelty often flourished not in ordinary village disputes but when state security or factional rivalry loomed. What of the legends that depict an almost artistic cruelty? Iron maidens, elaborate chairs, cages of venomous creatures. Researchers have combed legal texts, edicts, and archaeological evidence without confirming such devices as part of official practice. Some may echo real objects repurposed in folklore. Others likely stem from European fascination with Oriental despotism, a stereotype that painted non-Western societies as inherently tyrannical. The persistence of these myths says as much about colonial imagination as about Chinese governance. Even executions, though sometimes dramatic, were often framed by ceremony. A condemned person might be allowed a final meal, or have a sentence reduced during amnesties declared at imperial birthdays or new reigns. In a culture steeped in ritual, punishment expressed not only anger at wrongdoing, but also the cosmic balance between ruler and subject. Officials who mishandled procedures, executing without approval, or subjecting prisoners to unrecorded torment, risked censure from the very bureaucracy that authorized them. Women's experiences with punishment, while less chronicled, carried their own shadows. In family law disputes, wives accused of poisoning or infidelity might be interrogated under threat, yet magistrates were urged to prefer mediation or confinement to bodily pain. When prostitution laws tightened in urban centers, brothel keepers or clients could be flogged or paraded, but female workers were more often fined or assigned to state-supervised quarters than subjected to instruments of torture. Nevertheless, social shame, exposure at a market, being forced to wear placards, could wound as deeply as lashes, cutting a person off from respectability. By the dawn of the 20th century, reform swept away the remnants of older practices. The Qing New Penal Code of 1905 replaced bamboo rods with fixed prison terms, abolished lingchi, and sought to end confession by force. Judges trained in modern law schools emphasized written evidence over oral admission. Ironically, the era's cameras and newspapers froze older images, photographs of the last executions, sketches of collars or manacles, giving them a timeless quality just as they receded from life. Today, when people speak of ancient Chinese torture, they often imagine endless cruelty divorced from law or culture. But a patient reading of sources tells another story, an evolving legal system wrestling with how to secure loyalty, curb crime, and preserve hierarchy. Pain was present, yes, but it was seldom an end in itself. It functioned inside a matrix of duty, symbolism, and politics. And whenever rulers or officials overstepped, critics from within Chinese society, scholars, reformers, even emperors, called for limits, proving that debates over justice and humanity are not modern inventions but constants of history. Seeing the past in this way challenges us to resist caricature. It reminds us that behind the bamboo rods and wooden collars were human beings negotiating power, morality, and survival. Their stories are complicated. Magistrates agonizing over verdicts, convicts petitioning for mercy, dynasties altering codes in response to unrest. They lived in a world where law aimed to shape conduct and where even harshness could be argued as a form of order. As we close this journey, imagine again that candlelit hall where a magistrate weighs evidence by flickering lamplight. The instruments on the wall are not trophies of sadism but symbols of authority, meant, at least in principle, to steady society. Whether they brought justice or sorrow depended on who held them, how carefully rules were observed, and how a civilization understood the limits of state power. To study torture in ancient China is therefore not only to catalog punishments but to ask deeper questions about law, humanity, and the stories we tell about each other across centuries.